Hey, Old Testament people. Now, I know we finished our last section on the Old Testament, but what we're going to do here for the next 10 days or so is we're going to bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament by talking about the intertestamental period, that 400 years of silence from Malachi to Matthew. A lot of things happen in there, a lot of new things that pop up in the New Testament that you may wonder where they came from that weren't in the Old Testament, so we need to be talking about that. I want to just use this video as an introduction, show you the papers and things that you need to have that I put into your envelopes that you'll be working with. There's going to be some handouts, charts, and tables and stuff like that. There's going to be someone that has Roman procurators, judges, and Jew rulers. Something here about the Hasmoneans. You've got one about the family of Herod, and then there's a map of the second 2.2 temple. That is the little part that Ezra helped rebuild, and then the other part, the rest of the complex that Herod made bigger. There is a note packet, intertestamental period, that you have. It's maybe 11, 12 pages, where we're going to fill that in. And I hope like about 15-minute increments is what I want to try to shoot for. And in there as well are all the questions from the notes that are going to be on the final. So as you go along, take notes, then you want to go and fill out the appropriate parts of this and then review it. It's double-sided. That's it. This is all the information that you need to know for the final, but I wanted to make sure that you had all that stuff. I'm also going to be sending you the PowerPoint of the slideshow thing that I'll go over here in just a minute or two. Okay, I'm going to switch this bad boy over to me and my screen. So here we go. All right, slideshow time, everybody. Hope this works. Slideshow from the beginning. Hopefully I'm still on the screen when this all kicks in. Yes. Alrighty. So, intertestamental period. That's a mouthful. It's intertestamental. 6 syllables. What we're looking at are the 400 silent years between the testaments, or at least prophetic witness. That's what we're talking about in terms of silence. So there are a lot of things going on during that period. I've got a couple of books here that are main sources for the information. One of them here is called the Apocrypha. These are books written by Jews in those 400 years. And table of contents includes a preface. Great. The Apocrypha did form part of, it was like an appendix to the King James Version in 1611, as had been in all the preceding English versions from 1382. It was used in one sense by the Catholic Church as books that they thought were important, but not on the same level as Scripture. And so you get the table of contents, including the first and second book of Esdras, the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, additions to the book of Esther, the wisdom of Solomon, a book called Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Sirach, the book of Baruch, the story of Susanna, the song of the 3 children. That's actually like some commentary or some extra, like Lord of the Rings, the bonus material for Daniel's buddies in the fiery furnace. The story of Bel and the dragon, the prayer of Manasseh, so I suppose like here's his repentance prayer, and the first and second book of Maccabees, which some of you would recognize from Shai Linne's songs. Anyway, it's Jewish literature. Some of it's somewhat historical, some of it is kind of like fantasy material. And then secondly, I've got here the essential works of Josephus. Maybe you remember reading about Josephus, hearing about Josephus on number file videos. Part 1, Jewish Antiquities, him writing about Samuel, Saul, the kingdoms, the Hebrews in Egypt, etc. And then part 2 is what he witnessed, and that would be the Jewish Wars. So this is a really good intro to him It's got a lot of pictures in it. Places like Babylon, ruined gates of Ishtar. They got a lot of stuff about Roman equipment in here, places where battles were waged, um, faces, busts of people that were important. And here's like stuff about catapults and whatnot. But this is one of the main sources, a guy who experienced some of the, was writing in this period and gave us some of the information that we're looking at. So his name was Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian, not entirely to be trusted. Who else do we got here? We've got, the Maccabees, which was a family of Jews between the Greek and the Roman eras. Philo and other Roman historians writing about that period. We also get things about the rebuilding of the temple under Zerubbabel and Ezra the scribe. We got some stuff about the Torah and how it was almost turned into book worship. Samaritans and the schism there, how they built their own temple, but that Jesus uses them in his stories about what it means to be a good neighbor. There are still Samaritans today, by the way. We got Alexander the Great and his career, conquering the world and destroying cities like Tyre. And then we'll talk about culture. We're going to talk about Hellenistic culture in places like Alexandria, which had one of the 7 wonders of the world, of Pharos, the lighthouse, and how they made a copy of the Bible, a translation of the Bible that's still important today. So we'll be talking about the Septuagint. We also got the spread of Greek culture and Greek everything, and so we even had Jews that were either dressed like Greeks or dressed like Jewish people, and they had a schism there. We had like Republicans and Democrats. We've got superheroes for Jews, Judah Maccabee, the Hasmonean family. And then in come the Romans, like this Caesar, I think that's Pompey. And this guy here, played by Kieran Hines, the Herodian family, which we'll have several layers of in the New Testament. We'll talk about the buildings that Herod poured money into. And we got his tomb, the Herodium. And we got Masada, which makes for a fun story. What else? We got the Herods, the one that killed James, the one that was at Jesus' trial. We've got the one, there's Pontius Pilate. We've got then the Pharisees and the Sadducees, how they built a hedge around the law and made a whole bunch of extra laws. They had some special teachers like Hillel and I forget the other guy's name, Shammai. It was mostly oral, so as Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, that would be what these guys were putting out. We also have the Sadducees who didn't believe that there was a resurrection, like good old our friend Lazarus here. They controlled the Temple Mount and the high priesthood, which is super bizarre. At one point in Jesus's time on earth, there were 2 high priests and 1 high priest, and it was his father-in-law who was the other. That doesn't make sense. And how they honored Torah, and so they didn't believe in certain things. We got some weirdos out in the desert, the Essenes, copying the scriptures and all kinds of other apocalyptic literature. Their ruins are still out there. They found those things are called Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what they were working on. Washed their hands a lot. I think we'd understand that nowadays. But their stuff was found in caves out there in the desert and very well preserved in the dry, warm desert air. Today there's a whole shrine now to the book and all their Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff in Israel, and parts of it get circulated around the world for museums. We also get zealots. If you read, what was that book? The Bronze Bow, right? You got zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, a dagger man. You got all the various peoples of the land that Jesus was out and amongst and did healings and did many of his miracles. And then we got about the synagogue and where in the world that came from, because that's not in the Old Testament at all. So we'll talk about how it was set up, the actual building itself, and when it was originated and what kinds of things went on in there. We also got what it would look like to go to a synagogue service, what would be read, what would be done. You can read about experiences that Paul and Jesus had in synagogues, blessings that they would make. And then you got developments in the priests and Levites between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Anyway, I'm going to send you this exact same slideshow, so we'll talk about all their duties. We'll talk about the Sanhedrin, which is not in the Old Testament either, though it plays very prominently in the story of the New Testament. Okay, this one's going to be a little longer than the other ones, but yep, we're going to talk about these guys, and we're going to go over, look for answers to these questions right here. Okay, so if you're taking notes, which you are, on the sheet, let's try to get through this first page, and then I'll quit, and I'll kind of talk pretty fast here, so you might want to every now and hit pause and scribble some stuff down. So first question is, why would we study these 400 years of silence if really that we're to be students of the Bible? Well, the reason for that might be that what we get here in this 400 years provides a rich historical and cultural background for understanding the New Testament. If we want to know what some of the things and the situations that Jesus is in, and some of the terminology and the language that gets used, the whole cultural setup, the historical, cultural, grammatical, literal, all that kind of stuff that we'd use to be good interpreters of Scripture, we want to know something about the intertestamental period. The silent years were not silent historically. Lots of stuff happens during this silent period. There's Alexander the Great and his conquest of the world. There's the Romans' rise to power and conquering the land and setting up things like governors and kings and whatnot. There's soldiers in Jesus' stories. A big section of world history, very important old world history going on in these 400 years. There was the Punic Wars. There was the Greek city-states and the rise of those. And there was the wars between the Persians and the Greeks, the Peloponnesian Wars between Greek city-states, between Sparta and Athens. There was, Thermopylae and the battle at Marathon. All those kinds of things happened. The philosophers that arise, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and their worldviews that become very prevalent throughout the Roman world as we go into the book of Acts, and Paul goes into Macedonia, and he goes to Corinth, and he goes to Athens. We need to know the way that these people think. And the development of those things happens during this period that we're going to be looking at. So the silence is due to no prophetic voice here. Malachi says, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. And then it's nothing until John the Baptist shows up. No real prophets, biblical prophets, men sent by God to deliver the message of God, because God had told them it's going to be a certain amount of time and then Messiah will come. So where do we get the information about these years? Number one, chief source, Flavius Josephus. Okay, Josephus. Two main books, the Antiquities of the Jews, where he kind of recounts the history of the Old Testament again with some flourish and some extra material there that's probably some of it's out of his imagination or has built up over time as like folklore. That's published later in about 90 AD. And then his other work in 75 AD was what he witnessed. That would be the Jewish Wars. He gives an account, an eyewitness account, where he makes himself out to look pretty good in some of these situations. Like, oh, I didn't know what else to do, so I just let them kill everybody else except for me. And he becomes kind of a turncoat, and he kind of becomes a guide to the Romans, more or less to save his skin. But lots of really good information. It's just that you can't trust the exact truthfulness of everything Josephus has to say. I mean, if everybody else is dead, it's the victors that write histories. That is published in about 75 AD. Also, we've got the books of the Apocrypha, primarily the historical books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, though in there you get the Catholic justification for praying for the dead comes from, I believe it's 2nd Maccabees. Maybe we'll look at that when we get there. As well as some references in Philo and Roman historians as they comment on what's going on in Palestine at that time and the Romans and their conquests and military campaigns and whatnot, and who was a proconsul and who was a governor and all that kind of stuff in various regions that they had conquered. So we're going to be looking at 4 big time periods. We're going to do a little bit of overlap with the Old Testament in the Persian period, Persians to the Romans, 538. That number should ring a bell. So the Persian period, followed by the Hellenistic period, which would be the Greeks. We know that the Greeks conquered the Persians, and we have the spread of Greek culture and everything under Alexander the Great. And then after that, that's split up into 4 parts, which we read about in the book of Daniel. And there are 2 groups of Greeks that fought continuously over the Holy Lands. Eventually one won out, but then the Jews revolted against them and set up kind of their own little kingdom. That would be the Maccabean period. Under guys like Judah Maccabee and such, the Hasmonean family. And then once they got kicked out of power, the Roman period that's when we come to the New Testament. We'll secondly look at the period of the family of the Herods from 63 BC to AD 66. 4 generations: Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, and Herod Agrippa 1 and 2. So all the way from the story of the babies being killed in Bethlehem, all the way through Paul and his trials before Herod Agrippa, and I think Acts 26. We'll also look at different Jewish groups of the period: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the lawyers, all those kinds of things. Where did they come from? Fourthly, we're going to look at the religious life of the period: the temple, the synagogue, the Sanhedrins, kind of like the Supreme Court. Very interestingly, today the Jewish parliament is called the Knesset, which just basically is the same word for the synagogue. And so we're going to look kind of in detail as where these last 2, the synagogue and the Sanhedrin, originated. Yeah, so that's our overview. And again, I'm going to try to keep these to about 15-minute increments. And I'm going to probably go pretty fast, but you can pause me and get the details down in your notes. So our next episode will begin there at Roman numeral 2, from the Persians to the Romans. And just make sure that you have all the papers and stuff out as we do this, so you can fill in the stuff. Then remember, as soon as I'm done, you're going to want to pull this thing out and see if there's any of these things that you want, whether it fits into the Persian, Greek, Maccabean, or Roman period. This will be our first section that we'll do here coming up next. Okay, so that's the deal. If you got any questions, come and talk to me or send me a note, and we'll work through that. But some of these questions will be on your final exam. In the meantime, if you're not doing that, you should probably go back and start pulling out your old tests and make sure that they're corrected all the way back to, I believe, either at least as far back as the poetry exam, if not the post-exile. Okay, might be a good idea to start there and start looking back over those things. We don't have any verse quizzes. We don't have any Friday notes quizzes between now and finals. So this is your chance to kind of really hone up on that stuff, observations in these little videos, and reviewing for your final. That's your job over the next 10, 12 days or so. Okay, tune in next time for another exciting adventure episode of the Intertestamental period.